If you want to win in this city, you don't argue the law, you ask who owns the room. I learned that on my first day as a public defender, standing in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and quiet fear, watching a judge avoid eye contact like it might cost him something, and then I saw him, Alexander Kane, sitting in the front row like he wasn't just another observer, but the gravity holding everything in place, dark suit, still posture, eyes that didn't move unless they had to, and somehow every person in that room adjusted themselves around him without being told, like planets around a sun they couldn't escape. And I remember thinking this wasn't justice, this was choreography. And he was the one calling the steps, but I didn't lower my eyes, I didn't shift my weight, I just stood there with my case file and my $12 shoes and waited for the judge to speak because I'd made a promise to myself a long time ago that no matter how broken the system looked, I wouldn't be part of what made it worse. And when the hearing ended and people started filing out, I felt it. Before I saw it, that shift in the air like a storm deciding whether or not to break. And then his voice came, low, controlled, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Miss Carter. And I turned slow, steady, like I wasn't already calculating every exit in the room, like I hadn't noticed the way the bailiff suddenly found something very interesting on the opposite wall. And there he was closer now, taller than I expected, presence heavier than anything I'd ever stood near. And he didn't smile, didn't offer a hand, just studied me like I was something new in a world where nothing surprised him anymore. And for a second, just 1 second, I understood exactly why people folded around him, why deals got made before words were even spoken, because it would have been so easy to make this simple, to nod, to be polite, to step into the version of myself that survived instead of resisted. But I didn't. I held his gaze and let the silence stretch, and something in his eyes shifted, not anger, not yet, something sharper, curiosity, maybe like he just realized I wasn't part of the script, and that was the moment I knew this wasn't going to be just another case, because men like Alexander Kane didn't notice people like me unless something about us refused to bend. By the time I stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt different, heavier somehow, like the city itself was holding its breath, and I told myself it was nothing, just another long day, just another case in a system that had stopped pretending to be fair a long time ago. But then I saw the car parked across the street, black, polished, too expensive for this part downtown, and I did not need to see who stepped out to know it was him, because the moment the door opened, people moved, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to clear a path that had not been there a second before, and I kept walking because that was the only move I had ever trusted, forward, always forward, even when every instinct told me to stop, to turn, to choose the easier version of my life. But then his voice reached me again, closer this time, Miss Carter, and I stopped. Not because he told me to, but because I decided to, and I turned slowly, meeting his eyes without rushing, without hesitation, like I had all the time in the world, even though I could feel my pulse in my throat, steady but loud. And he studied me again, that same quiet intensity, like he was trying to solve something that did not make sense to him. And then one of his men stepped forward, holding a slim envelope, clean, precise, the kind of thing that did not need explanation. And it was almost funny how ordinary it looked, how simple the transaction could have been. Just a small shift, a small compromise, and everything in my life would change. Student loans gone, rent no longer a question, a future that did not depend on how many hours I could survive without sleep. And for a second, just one, I let myself imagine it. The relief, the silence of not having to fight every single day. But then I looked at him again, really looked this time at the way he stood like the outcome was already decided, like the world had taught him that nothing truly resisted him for long. And I realized something that felt sharper than fear. If I took that envelope, I would not just be accepting money, I would be agreeing with him, agreeing that everything had a price, including me. And that was not something I could afford, not even for a second. So I reached out, took the envelope, felt the weight of it in my hand, and then I placed it back against his man's chest, firm, controlled, no hesitation. I think you have the wrong person, I said, my voice steady enough that it surprised even me. And for the first time, there was a crack in the silence around him, not loud, not obvious, but real, like something had shifted just slightly off balance. And when I looked back at Alexander Kane, I did not see anger. Not yet. I saw something else, something deeper, something that made my stomach tighten in a way fear never had, because it was not the look of a man who had been refused, it was the look of a man who had just become interested. Interest is a dangerous thing when it comes from a man like him, because it does not fade, it sharpens, it follows, and by the next morning, I felt it before I even saw it, the subtle shift in how people looked at me in the courthouse hallway, like they knew something I did not, or worse, like they were waiting to see what I would do next. And I kept my head down, not out of fear, but out of focus, because I had a case to prepare, a client who still believed someone might actually listen, and I refused to let his world bleed into mine, but it already had. I realized that when I walked into the courtroom and the usual quiet chatter died a second too fast, when the clerk avoided my eyes, when even the judge adjusted his glasses like he suddenly needed more time, and then I saw him again, same seat, same stillness, but something about him had changed, or maybe it was me who saw it differently now, because this time his attention did not drift, it stayed on me, steady, deliberate, like he had made a decision overnight, and I was now part of it. And I told myself it did not matter, that I had faced worse than a powerful man with too much control, that I had built my life on not needing permission from people like him. But there's a difference between knowing something and feeling it in your bones. And when the hearing began, I felt it, the invisible weight pressing against every word, every pause, like the outcome was already leaning in a direction I had not agreed to. And still I spoke, clear, steady, laying out the facts the way I always did, because truth should not have to compete. It should stand on its own. But in this room, truth felt like it needed backup. And for the first time in a long time, I understood just how tilted the scales were, not because I was losing, but because someone had already decided what winning meant. And when I finished, there was a moment, just a second, where everything held still, like the room itself was waiting for a signal. And I did not look at the judge. I looked at him because I needed to know, needed to see if this was all part of his design. And he did not smile, did not nod, did not give anything away, just watched me with that same quiet focus. And somehow that was worse, because it meant he was not forcing the outcome. He was letting it happen, like he trusted the system he had built to move exactly the way he wanted without him needing to touch it. And that was when something inside me shifted, not fear, not doubt, something sharper, something that refused to accept that this was how it had to be. Because if he could control everything without saying a word, then the only thing left that he did not control was me. And I realized in that moment that this was no longer just about the case. It was about proving that not everything in his world could be owned. Pressure does not always come with noise. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in small changes that no one mentions, but everyone feels. And by the third day, I could feel it tightening around me like something invisible but deliberate, a missing document that should have been on my desk, but was not, a call from a clerk that ended too quickly, a witness who suddenly needed more time, and none of it was enough to accuse, none of it was obvious. But together it formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore, and I knew exactly where that pattern led, even if no one would ever say his name out loud. And still I refused to react, because reacting meant acknowledging him, meant stepping into his version of the game, and I had no intention of playing by rules I did not agree to. So I worked longer hours, earlier mornings, reviewing every page twice, then 3 times, searching for something solid, something that could not be moved or reshaped by quiet influence. And that was when I found it. Not big, not dramatic, just a detail buried in a timeline that did not quite line up, the kind of thing most people would overlook because it did not seem important on its own, but had learned a long time ago that truth rarely announces itself. It hides, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. And as I sat there in my small apartment, files spread across a table that had seen better days, I felt something shift again, but this time it was not pressure. It was clarity, the kind that cuts through doubt and leaves only one direction forward. And for the first time since this started, I allowed myself a small breath of certainty, not that I would win, but that I had something real, something that did not belong to him. And the next morning I walked into the courthouse differently, not slower, not faster, just more certain, like I was carrying something he could not see yet. And when I stepped into the courtroom, I felt his attention immediately. Sharper this time, like he sensed the change even if he did not know the reason. And I did not look at him right away. I placed my files down, adjusted the papers, let the routine settle me. And only then did I lift my eyes, meeting his gaze without hesitation. And there was again that quiet intensity, but underneath it now was something else, something almost like anticipation, and it told me everything I needed to know. This was no longer just interest. This was engagement, and men like. Alexander Kane did not engage unless something mattered. And for the first time, I realized that I was no longer just resisting his world. I was pulling his attention into mine, and that was dangerous in a way I had not prepared for, because attention from a man like him was not something you could simply walk away from. It followed, it adapted, it learned, and as the judge called the room to order and the hearing began again, I understood that whatever happened next, this was the moment the balance started to shift. Not because he lost control, but because for the first time he was no longer the only one influencing how this would end. The moment you realize someone powerful is paying attention to you is the moment everything becomes a test. And I felt it the second I started speaking. The way the room leaned in just a fraction more than before, the way the judge hesitated half a beat longer, like something unseen was being recalculated in real time. I did not rush. I let the silence sit, because silence can be a weapon if you know how to hold it. And then I introduced the detail, small, precise, almost forgettable if. You were not looking for it, a timestamp that did not align, a record that existed in two places at once when it should not have, and I watched it land, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make the foundation shift under everything that had been quietly assumed. And for the first time since this began, I saw uncertainty flicker across the judge's face, quick, controlled, but real, and that was all I needed. Not victory, just movement, because movement meant the outcome was no longer fixed, and I felt it ripple outward, through the clerk, through the opposing counsel, through the quiet observers who had learned to read rooms like this better than they read laws. And then, without meaning to, I looked at him, and Alexander Kane was no longer just watching. He was focused in a way that felt sharper, like I had stepped into a space he had not expected anyone to reach. And there was no anger there, no frustration, just something deeper, something calculating, like he was adjusting to a new variable. And that should have scared me more than anything, but it did not, because for the first time I understood something clearly. He did not control everything. Not completely, not absolutely, because if he did, this moment would not exist. This shift would not be happening. And that meant there was a line somewhere, a boundary even he could not cross without consequence. And my job was to find it before he did, and push it just far enough to matter. And as I finished, as the words settled into the room like something heavier than argument, I stepped back, not triumphantly, not dramatically, just enough to let the space breathe, and the judge cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses again. But this time it was different. This time it was not avoidance. It was consideration, and that's single. Change felt louder than anything that had happened so far, because it meant the system had not completely forgotten how to think for itself. And when the session paused and people began to move again, quieter now, more careful, I gathered my files slowly, aware of the shift but not distracted by it. Because moments like this are fragile. They can disappear if you celebrate them too early. And as I turned to leave, I felt it again. His presence closer this time, not physically but intentionally, like a decision had been made. And I knew without looking that this was not over, that whatever line I had just crossed, he was about to step across it too. The real danger is not when a powerful man notices you. It is when he decides to step into your world instead of pulling you into his. And I realized that was exactly what Alexander Kane was doing when I found him waiting. Not in the courtroom, not surrounded by people who moved for him, but outside, near the steps where the city noise refused to quiet down for anyone. And for a second it felt unreal. Like seeing something out of place that your mind takes a moment to accept, because men like him did not wait. They summoned, and yet there he was, hands in his coat pockets, posture relaxed but deliberate, like he had already decided this conversation would happen. And when his eyes found mine, there was no surprise, only recognition, like he had been expecting this exact moment. And I kept walking, because stopping too soon would feel like yielding, but not stopping at all would feel like avoidance. So I chose the space in between, close enough to hear him, far enough to remind myself I still had control over my own steps. And he spoke first, of course. He did, but not the way I expected, No threats, no offers, just a simple question. What did you find? And it caught me off guard more than anything else could have because it was not a demand, it was curiosity. And I studied him for a second before answering, weighing silence against honesty and realizing that silence would only feed whatever conclusions he was already forming. So I gave him just enough. Something real, I said, and that was when I saw it, that slight shift again, not frustration, not impatience, something closer to respect, and it unsettled me more than any pressure had, because respect from someone like him was not a gift, it was an invitation, and invitations like that came with expectations. And he stepped closer, not invading, not forcing, just enough to narrow the space between us so that the rest of the world faded a little at the edges. "You think that changes anything?" he asked, and his voice was still calm, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now. Something I had not heard before, not doubt, but interest in the answer, like he genuinely wanted to know if I believed what I was doing mattered. And I held his gaze steady because this was the moment that defined everything that came after, not the courtroom, not the case, this right here where it was just him and me and the truth we were both circling. "It changes enough," I said, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Because it was not empty, it was full of everything neither of us was saying, and for the first time since this began, I saw something real in his expression, not the controlled mask he wore for the world, but something underneath it, something that looked almost like recognition, like he had just realized that I was not going to bend, not today, not later, not ever, and instead of pushing back, instead of correcting me, he did something I did not expect. He stepped back, just slightly, just enough to return the space I had chosen earlier. And that single movement told me more than any words could have, because men like Alexander Kane did not give space unless they had decided it was worth observing what someone would do with it. And as I turned to leave, feeling his eyes follow me, but not stop me, I understood that this was no longer just a conflict of power. It was something else entirely, something quieter, more dangerous, because now he was not trying to control me. He was trying to understand me. Understanding someone like him is not something you plan for. It happens in the spaces between what is said and what is left unsaid. And over the next few days, I started to notice the difference, not in what he did, but in what he stopped doing. The pressure did not disappear, but it no longer tightened the same way. The missing documents stopped disappearing. The calls came through without interruption. The small invisible shifts that had once worked against me now simply did not. And that was not coincidence, not in a city like this, not in a system like this. And I told myself it did not matter, that I would take the opening and keep moving forward. But a part of me knew better, knew that this was not freedom. It was allowance, and allowance always came with a reason. And I hated that thought more than I feared him, because it meant I was still inside his reach, just in a different way. And that realization sat with me as I prepared for the next hearing, going over every detail. Again, refining every argument, not because I doubted my case, but because I could feel something building, something quiet and deliberate, like a shift in direction that had not fully revealed itself yet. And when I walked into the courtroom that morning, it was different again, not just for me, but for everyone. The tension had changed, less rigid, more uncertain, like the room itself was no longer sure which way it would lean. And when I looked toward his usual place, he was not there, and that absence should not have meant anything. But it did, because for the first time since this began, I could not read his position, could not anticipate how far his influence extended in that moment. And that uncertainty forced me to rely on something I trusted more than any system, my own judgment. And when the hearing began, I did not hold back. I pushed the timeline discrepancy further, connected it to a larger pattern, something that had been overlooked because no one expected it to matter. And I watched as it unfolded, piece by piece, not dramatically, not loudly, but with enough weight to shift the direction of the room. And when the judge leaned forward, actually leaned forward, asking questions instead of avoiding them, I felt it again, that movement, that subtle but undeniable change. And for a brief second, something like hope flickered, not the kind that depends on outcome, but the kind that comes from knowing the fight is real, that it is not just performance anymore. And as the session paused, as people moved with more uncertainty than before, I gathered my things slowly, aware that something had changed, but not fully understanding how. And that was when I felt it again, not his presence, but his absence being replaced, because when I stepped outside, when the noise of the city filled the space where the courtroom tension had been, I saw him across the street, not watching the building, not watching the people, watching me, and this time there was no distance in it, no calculation I could easily read, just a steady, quiet focus that felt more personal than anything before, and I realized in that moment that whatever he had been doing behind the scenes, whatever he had adjusted or stepped back from, it was not because he had lost control, it was because he had chosen not to use it. And that choice was far more dangerous than any pressure he had applied before. When a man who controls everything chooses not to use that control, it is not mercy, it is intention. And I felt that intention settle around me the moment I realized nothing else was interfering, no missing pieces, no quiet pressure, just the case, just the facts, just me. And that should have made things easier, but it did not, because now there was no one else to blame, no invisible force to push against, just the truth of whether I was good enough to stand on my own without the resistance that had defined every step so far. And that realization sat heavy as I walked back into my apartment that night, the city noise fading behind me, replaced by the kind of silence that forces you to hear your own thoughts. And for the first time since this began, I questioned something I had not allowed myself to. Before, not the case, not the system, but him, why he stepped back, why he allowed the space, why someone who could shape outcomes without effort would choose to watch instead. And the more I thought about it, the less it felt like strategy, and the more it felt like something else, something I did not have a name for yet. And that unsettled me more than any pressure ever had, because pressure is predictable, it pushes, it forces, but this was different. This was observation, and observation meant he was waiting to see what I would do when nothing stood in my way. And that thought followed me into the next morning, into the courthouse, into the courtroom where everything felt sharper, clearer, like the air had been stripped of something I'd gotten used to. And when I stood to speak, I felt it immediately. No resistance, no subtle shift, just the weight of the room responding only to what I said. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt almost unreal, like stepping into a version of the system I had always believed should exist, and I did not hesitate. I moved through the argument with precision, connecting the details, reinforcing the pattern, letting the truth build on itself without interruption, and I saw it land. Not because of influence, not because of pressure, but because it made sense, because it was real, and when the judge leaned forward again, asking questions that mattered, questions that showed he was actually listening, I felt something shift inside me, something quieter than victory but stronger than doubt. And when I finished, when the words settled and the room held that same breath it always did before a decision, I did not look at the judge. I did not look at anyone else. I looked at the empty space where he usually sat. And for a second, I wondered if this was what he wanted all along, not control, not compliance, but proof. Proof that something in this city could still function without him. And that thought stayed with me as the session ended, as people moved again, slower now, more thoughtful, like they were adjusting to a new reality they did not fully understand yet. And when I stepped outside, expecting the noise, the movement, the distraction of the world returning, I saw him again, closer. This time, no distance, no separation, just him standing there like he had never left. And when our eyes met, there was no question in his, no calculation I could easily read, just something steady, something deliberate. And in that moment, I understood that whatever line had been crossed, we were both standing on the same side of it now. There's a moment when something shifts so quietly that no one else notices, but you feel it in your chest like a second heartbeat. And that was exactly what it felt like standing there across from him. The city moving around us like nothing had changed while everything between us had. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was standing against him. I felt like I was standing with him in a space neither of us fully controlled. And that realization should have been a warning, but instead it felt like clarity, like understanding something I had been resisting from the beginning, because this was never just about power, it was about choice, and he had made one, not to interfere, not to bend the outcome, and that choice carried weight in a way I had not expected. And he stepped closer again, not to close the distance completely, just enough to remind me that it was still there. Still something we both acknowledged without crossing. And his voice when he spoke, was quieter than before, almost thoughtful. You were getting close. And it was not a threat, not a promise, just an observation. And I held his gaze, searching for something in it, something that would tell me whether this was still a game to him or something else entirely. Close is not enough, I said, because it was the truth, because getting close meant nothing if the system snapped back into place at the last second. And for a brief moment, something like approval flickered across his expression, subtle but unmistakable, and it unsettled me more than anything else had, because it meant he was not just watching anymore. He was measuring, not the case, not the outcome, but me, and that realization settled deeper than I wanted to admit, because being measured by someone like him was not neutral. It changed things. It redefined the space you were standing and whether you agreed to it or not. And he stepped back again, that same controlled movement, like he was careful not to push too far, not to break whatever balance had formed between us. And that restraint told me more than anything else could have, because men who are used to control do not hold back unless they have decided something is worth preserving. And I should have walked away then, should have left before that thought had time to settle, but I did not. I stayed just long enough to say what had been building in my mind since. The courtroom, why? And it was a simple question, but it carried everything I could not name. Why step back? Why allow this? Why watch instead of act? And for the first time since I had met him, Alexander Kane did not answer immediately. He held my gaze, steady, unreadable. And then he said something I had not expected, something that did not fit into the version of him I'd built in my head. Because I want to see if you can, and the simplicity of it hit harder than any threat ever could have, because it was not about him anymore, not about his control or his influence. It was about whether I could stand without it, whether I could prove that something in this city still worked the way it was supposed to. And as I walked away, the noise of the street filling the space between us again, I realized that whatever this had become, it was no longer just a fight. It was a test, and not just for me, but for him too. Tests are not announced. They unfold quietly in moments where you either hold your ground or you do not. And the next hearing felt exactly like that. Not louder, not more dramatic, just sharper, like everything had narrowed down to a single point that neither of us could ignore anymore. And as I walked into the courtroom, I could feel it again, that shift in the air, but this time it was not pressure or absence. It was expectation, like the room itself was waiting to see if what had started would actually follow through. And I took my place, set my files down, let my hands rest for a second longer than usual, not because I was unsure, but because I needed to feel the weight of the moment fully. And when I looked up, he was there again, back in his usual seat, but something about him was different, not less controlled, not less present, but more still, like it already made whatever decision mattered, and now all that remained was to watch it unfold. And I realized then that whatever this had become, he was no longer trying to influence it. He was committing to it. And that realization settled deep as the hearing began, as the judge called the room to order with a voice that carried more steadiness than before. And I stood when it was my turn, not rushing, not hesitating, just stepping into the space I had been building towards since the beginning. And I laid it out, piece by piece, not just the inconsistency, not just the timeline, but the pattern behind it, the way everything connected in a way that could not be dismissed as coincidence. And I felt the room respond, not with silence this time, but with attention, real attention, the kind that cannot be forced or bought. And when I finished, there was no immediate movement, no quick dismissal, just a pause that held more weight than anything that had come before, and the judge leaned forward again, slower this time, more deliberate, asking questions that mattered, questions that showed he was not just listening, but thinking. And that was when I understood just how far things had shifted, because this was no longer about proving something against resistance. This was about proving something on its own, without interference, without excuse. And as I answered, as I held steady under that focus, I felt it, not confidence, not relief, something deeper, something that felt like alignment, like everything I had been pushing against had finally moved just enough to let the truth stand where it was supposed to. And when the questioning ended, when the room settled into that same heavy silence before a decision, I did not look at the judge. I did not look at anyone else. I looked at him, and for the first time since I had met him, there was no distance in his gaze, no calculation I could not reach, just something steady, something that looked almost like certainty, and in that moment I realized something I had not fully understood until now. This was not just my test, it was his too, because if the outcome followed the truth, if the system held even for this one moment, then it meant something he had built his entire world around was no longer absolute. And that was a risk he had chosen to take, not for power, not for control, but for something else entirely, something I was only just beginning to understand. The silence before a decision is never empty. It is filled with everything that has led to it, every word, every choice, every moment where someone could have changed the outcome but did not. And as I stood there waiting, I felt all of it settle around me, not as pressure, but as weight, the kind that does not push you down but holds you steady. And for the first time since this began, I was not bracing for impact. I was ready for whatever came next because I knew I had done everything I could, without compromise, without bending. And that mattered more than the result itself. And the judge shifted in his seat, slower than usual, more deliberate, like he understood what this moment meant beyond just the case in front of him. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something I had not heard before, not hesitation, not avoidance, but responsibility. And each word landed with a clarity that made the room feel sharper, more real. And I listened, not to the outcome, but to the way it was delivered, because that was where the truth lived, in the tone, in the certainty, in the absence of something unseen guiding it. And when it ended, when the decision settled into the space between us all, there was no immediate reaction, just a stillness that felt different from anything that had come before, not heavy, not tense, just clear, like something had finally aligned the way it was supposed to. And I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, not relief, not victory, something quieter, something that felt like confirmation. And I gathered my files slowly, not rushing, not lingering, just moving forward the way I always had, but this time with a different understanding of what that meant. And when I turned, when I allowed myself to look at him again, Alexander Kane was already watching, but his expression had changed in a way I could not immediately define. It was not disappointment, not frustration, not even surprise. It was something deeper, something that looked almost like acceptance. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw the shift not just in the room, not just in the system, but in him, like something he had believed to be absolute had just been proven otherwise. And instead of resisting it, instead of correcting it, he allowed it to exist. And that was the most unexpected part of all, because men like him do not accept limits easily. They break them, reshape them, erase them if necessary. But he did none of that. He stayed exactly where he was, watching, not with control, not with calculation, but with something that felt almost like respect. And that realization settled into me in a way I could not ignore, because it meant that whatever this had been, whatever line we had both crossed without naming it, it had changed something real, not just in the outcome of a single case, but in the space between us. And as I walked past him, close enough to feel the presence I had once resisted so strongly, I did not slow down, did not hesitate, but I also did not pretend he was not there, because pretending no longer made sense, not after everything that had happened. And as I stepped out into the city, into the noise and movement that had nothing to do with what had just taken place, I understood something clearly for the first time. This was not an ending. It was a beginning, not of something simple, not of something easy, but of something neither of us could fully control anymore. And that was exactly what made it real. Change does not announce itself with noise. It settles in quietly, in the way things feel different even when they look the same. And in the days that followed, I could feel it everywhere, not in the headlines, not in the conversations people had out loud, but in the small moments that used to go unnoticed. The way a clerk met my eyes without hesitation, the way a judge asked a question instead of avoiding one, the way the system, for just a moment, seemed to remember what it was supposed to be. And I told myself it was temporary, that things like this did not last, that systems built on control do not suddenly rewrite themselves because of one case, one decision, one moment of clarity. But even as I thought it, I knew something had shifted, not completely, not permanently, but enough to leave a mark. And I carried that awareness with me as I moved through my days, through new cases, new rooms, new faces that still carried the same quiet tension, but now held something else beneath it, something uncertain. Like people were starting to question things they had long accepted, and that uncertainty spread slowly, not dramatically, but steadily, and I realized that change does not need to be loud to be real. It just needs to exist. And in the middle of all of that, there was him, not always present, not always visible, but never entirely gone, like a shadow that had shifted position but not disappeared, and I noticed it in the absence of interference, in the way things continued to move without being redirected, in the way no one stepped in to correct what had already been allowed to stand. And that told me everything I needed to know, because it meant his choice had not been temporary. It had been intentional. And intention, once made, is not easily undone. And still, I did not seek him out, did not try to define what this had become, because some things lose their meaning the moment you try to name them too soon. And I had learned enough to understand that this was not something simple, not something that fit into the categories I was used to. And then one evening, as the city slowed into that quiet moment between day and night, I saw him again, not outside a courthouse, not surrounded by anything that belonged to his world, but standing alone on the sidewalk, looking at something I could not see. And for a second I considered walking past, letting the moment remain unspoken. But something in me chose differently, something that had been building since the beginning, and I stepped toward him, not cautiously, not boldly, just honestly, the way I had stood in every room since this started. And when he turned, when his eyes met mine again, there was no distance left, no space filled with assumption or calculation, just recognition, clear and steady. And neither of us spoke right away, because words felt unnecessary in that moment, like they would only reduce something that had taken time to become what it was. And as we stood there in a city that still moved around us without noticing, I understood something with a clarity that did not need explanation. This was not about control anymore, not about resistance or power or proving anything to anyone else. This was about what remained when all of that was stripped away, and what remained was choice. Some endings do not feel like conclusions. They feel like doors opening into something you're not expecting, but somehow always moving toward. And standing there with him, in that quiet space where the city faded just enough to let something real exist, I realized this was one of those moments, not defined by what had happened in the courtroom, not by the decision or the shift in the system, but by what remained after all of it. And what remained was something neither of us had planned for, something that did not fit into power or resistance or control. And for the first time since I had met him, I did not see Alexander Kane as the man who owned everything around him. I saw him as someone standing in the same uncertainty. I was someone who had chosen to step back from everything he could control just to see what would happen if he did not. And that choice changed something fundamental, not just in him, but in me, because it forced me to confront something I had always believed, but never tested this way. That integrity is not just about refusing what is wrong. It is about standing firm, even when doing so changes the balance of everything around you. And I held his gaze, steady, not challenging, not yielding, just present. And for a brief moment, the distance between us felt like something we both understood without needing to cross. And he gave a small nod, not agreement, not surrender, just acknowledgement, like he had seen what he needed to see, and that was enough. And as I turned to leave, not because I had to, but because I chose to, I did not feel like I was walking away from him. I felt like I was walking forward with something new, something that would shape every step that came after, and the city greeted me the same way it always did. Loud, indifferent, moving too fast to notice what had just shifted beneath it, but I noticed. And that was what mattered, because change does not need to be seen by everyone to be real. It only needs to be held by the people who are willing to act on it. And this story, this moment, it is not about winning or losing. It is about the quiet power of refusing to be shaped by a system that expects you to bend. It is about the courage to stand in your values, even when the cost is high and the outcome is uncertain. And most importantly, it is about the truth that real change does not begin with power. It begins with one person deciding that they will not be bought. Not today, not ever. So wherever you are, whatever system you're a part of, remember this: you may not control the world around you, but you always control who you become within it. And sometimes that is enough to change everything.